today, when we see a crisis has happened and Indian foreign policy is becoming much pro-Western centric, thinking that Canada is not with India and vice versa, it's definitely a huge blow to the liberal international order. But I think the way Indian foreign policy is positioned today and the way Canada is looking at Indo-Pacific, there is always a breeze to close this gap that the Khalistan issue has opened between Canada and India. And I think it's just a matter of time before we resolve this issue.
Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, foreign policy, and international relations. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. In today's episode, Dr. Jagannath Panda spoke about the current state of Canada-India relations, highlighting a deep crisis in both diplomatic and political spheres. He noted that this crisis has created a significant divide between the leaders of India and Canada, as well as strained diplomatic ties. Nonetheless, Panda highlights the potential for cooperation between our two countries, given our roles in the Indo-Pacific region, and urged efforts to overcome the recent challenges. This is the Expert Series. Dr. Panda, pleasure to have you on the program today. Thanks for joining us. What would you say that this recent diplomatic incident says about Canada and India's relationship at present?
I think let me start by making this point that I think Canada-India relation is in deep crisis, definitely. And there is no shying away to acknowledge the fact that not only there is a diplomatic crisis, but also a political crisis. So what this crisis has done is that it has created further gap among the two top leaders in India and in Canada. And also what it has created is a diplomatic row between the Canadian and the Indian diplomatic communities. So when this thing happens, we can call it a crisis, because either the political leaders or the diplomatic communities, the diplomatic officials, they are the bridge between the two countries. And when both the communities seems to be showing a antipathy towards each other, then a crisis is definitely there, and we must acknowledge that.
How would you say India assesses the current threat level posed by Sikh separatism, both within India and abroad, and how does this assessment play into its foreign policy?
I don't think India sees the Sikh community or any extremist groups in the Sikh community as a threat to India's national security planning. And I think what India says is that those Sikh communities who believes in extremist actions, course of actions, that is not in conducive to the peace and stability of India's relationship with Canada, and with the peace and stability of the human beings, that is seen as a threat and a national security concern. So there is a distinction one has to make, what India is saying and what India is not saying. What India is saying is that the extremist groups, if they have a point of view, they are supposed to express it freely without any barriers. But they should not carry out any activities which is against India, which is against India's national interest. So this is the distinction has to be drawn and has to be understood from India's point of view. And I think Canada will do a big favor to India if among the diplomatic community and among the strategic communities, there is a clarity of thought happens on India's position on the Khalistan movement. But at the same time, what India also needs to do is that India also needs to take into account some of the issues seriously, yet not so provocatively. And I think what this incident has exposed is that I think India is becoming quite vocal about its national security issues, but the medium of expression has to be subtle. The diplomatic actions, the political nexus with the foreign counterparts has to be in a smooth and subtle manner, which will not affect the bilateral relationship.
What does India's foreign policy look like under Modi, and what implications would you say this has for its global engagement?
Well, Indian foreign policy is actually undergoing a lot of proactive measures. We are seeing under the rubrics of multi-alignment, India is becoming much focused in terms of dealing with authoritarian powers and in terms of strengthening the ties with many countries who believes in the liberal world order, in the democratic world order. And I think in that context, Indian foreign policy is is undergoing a lot of changes. But what is interesting about Indian foreign policy is that if we do not really, take into account the incident that has recently occurred, and see the Canada-India relationship more from a holistic point of view, this has been a safe relationship for many years, and this was supposed to be one of the major relationships in the Indo-Pacific age in times to come. And I think if we look back to the history, Indian foreign policy always looked at Canada much more positively, be it the UN, United Nations General Assembly, be it the Commonwealth group of nations, be it during the major crisis, Suez Canal crisis to the Korean War armistice crisis. In all of these issues, in all of these global forums, India and Canada have supported each other. So today, when we see a crisis has happened and Indian foreign policy is becoming much pro-Western centric, thinking that Canada is not with India and vice versa, it's definitely a huge blow to the liberal international order. But I think the way Indian foreign policy is positioned today and the way Canada is looking at Indo-Pacific, there is always a breeze to close this gap that the Khalistan issue has opened between Canada and India. And I think it's just a matter of time before we resolve this issue.
Given that we're increasingly moving towards a multipolar world, how would you say India is positioning itself within that world? And what would you say are some of the key drivers of some of its decisions, especially in cases where values and interests might conflict?
Well, values and interests are quite debatable terms in international politics, as you know, Jose. I think values can be interpreted differently, and when we're talking about Western values, Asian values, values in the Indian context, it all could differ, and this is where the dispute in most of the international issues arise. And I think it's like that popular statement: "One man's terrorist is another man." One country's terrorist is another country's freedom fighter. So I think we need to really get it right, what we call values and what we call interest, because these are subjective terms. This could be very highly debatable in international politics and in international affairs. And in that context, I don't think India and Canada are on the same page on each and every issues. Even though we tend to believe that values and interest are the concepts which brings India and Canada together as democratic countries in the Indo-Pacific, believing in liberal international order and rules-based order. But then within that liberal international order and rules-based order that we are talking about, both the countries have a different game plan, different perspective on many issues, including what we call values and interest. And I think from India's point of view, India would like to see that India's interest, which is very close to India's value system, historically, civilizationally, and respecting with all the religions and communities, must be taken in high pride and high respect. And this is where India would expect not only from Canada, but also with a range of Western countries who are partners in the Indo-Pacific, and Canada is no different from that context. So therefore, when you're talking about India's values and interests in the Indo-Pacific, it's not entirely different from the values and interest of Canada or other Western countries, but the very fact how we interpret them, how we practice them in the context of practical circumstances of Indo-Pacific politics, that has to be said.
What would you say are some of the major security challenges India faces in the Indo-Pacific region, and how is it working to address them, perhaps through bilateral or multilateral engagements?
I think it's undoubtedly is the Chinese threat, and the way China under Xi Jinping has emerged as an authoritarian power, encroaching upon different countries' territories, affecting national security issues, and the way China has emerged as a credible maritime power affecting some of the countries in the Indo-Pacific regions, that's a major concern, which not only for India, but also for many Western countries, including Canada. In fact, the China issue and the kind of authoritarian power we have seen in the Chinese foreign policy kind of a Chinese foreign policy behavior under Xi Jinping, I think that has in a way brought the understanding together between Canada and India, and that should not be lost out in the process. And I think when we talk about the future of Indo-Pacific, Canada is a critical country to the preservation of Indo-Pacific as a region, as a spatial concept, and therefore India would like to see Canada as a partner staying intact in the future of Indo-Pacific construct. More importantly, what we are seeing, there is a combination of authoritarian powers who are emerging as a much more credible union, as a much more credible alliance partners in the Eurasian regions, which are threatening the security in the Indo-Pacific regions, particularly affecting the rules-based order. And I think in that context, both India, Canada, and many of the Western countries, they have got a common task to think about how to preserve this liberal international order that we have been living with. The values, the interest, the national security centric issues could be different from each other. But then when it comes to peace and stability in the regions, that should bind together the like-minded countries like India and Canada, including some of the Western powers, those who are the partners in the Indo-Pacific construct.
How does India view China's growing assertiveness and rise in the Indo-Pacific region, and how does China's rise impact India?
Oh, well, I think if we take into account the China's rise over the last 2 decades or so, there are two sets of China's rise. One is China is emerging. One thing is very clear, that China is emerging as a revisionist power. But within that revisionist power, there are two aspects that needs to be identified. One, China as an evolutionary revisionist power. The second, China as a revolutionary revisionist power. And I think these are the two aspects that India is really concerned about. One is that China promising to be an evolutionary revisionist power, trying to reform the Bretton Woods institutions like WTO, World Bank, IMF, and all. And to that extent, I think India is with China. But at the same time, what we have seen, China not really valuing those evolutionary revisionist tendencies that China actually envisioned with India as an emerging economy and trying to establish a kind of equitable world order. But today what we see, China deviating from the evolutionary revisionist path and trying to become a revolutionary revisionist power by bringing, massive infrastructure, territorial incursion, maritime, revisionism, trying to establish artificial islands in South China Sea, and not only that, in trying to change the status quo through land and territorial, disputes and conflicts. And I think that's something which has really troubled India and many other countries in the Indo-Pacific region. So China's rise as a revolutionary revisionist power, trying to change the status quo on the territorial domains to the maritime domains, is something which is really worrisome from India's point of view. And the way China is emerging as a mercantilist and a neo-mercantilist power, that's a huge significant developments in the Indo-Pacific regions. That comes as a bigger threat to India. Today, if we see, China is emerging as a country where China is having much more trade surplus with most of the trading countries in Asia and outside Asia. And that's not a small development. So when we are seeing China as a neo-mercantilist power, China as a revolutionary revisionist power, that becomes a deadly combination. And that is what something which is worrying India. And there India is taking a lot of initiatives to emerge as a credible Indo-Pacific powers. Today, I think under the current government in Delhi, we are talking about Sagar concept, which is security and growth for all in the regions. That means we're talking about an Indo-Pacific order where every country will have an equitable participation. We are talking about shared leadership in Indo-Pacific. We are talking about security and growth for all. That means let's securitize the regions and go for economic growth of the regions. And this is where India believes that the liberal international order should be preserved. And therefore, we have been talking about the progress of the like-minded countries coalitions in the Indo-Pacific who could build and build a stronger liberal international order. and could pose a challenge to the authoritarian powers like China and what China is building up with Russia and North Korea. And I think these are the issues which is troubling India for last 1 decade. And India is very mindful about its relationship with Indo-Pacific powers like with the US, with Japan, with Australia, including some of the other Western critical countries like United Kingdom, with Canada. So the recent developments in Canada and India relations is really a unwelcome development. Again, I would like to see the future of Indo-Pacific construct, or the age of the Indo-Pacific that we are living with. I would like to see a strong Canada-India relations emerging from here. Every crisis lives with an opportunity, and I think the crisis that has happened in Canada and India relations is definitely uncalled for. But then we have seen that international relations after major crisis, they take a new turn, and they review the potential and the future progress, the future potential of every relationship. And to that extent, I think both Canada and India are critical partners and critical flag bearers of the future of Indo-Pacific. The recent downturn should not really affect the defense ties between Canada and India, the economic ties. There is a huge credible Indian population in Canada, and the defense ties between Canada and India is growing. And in fact, we have seen the statement coming from one of the top defense personnel in Canada that the recent crisis should not really affect Canada-India ties, and I am hopeful it is not definitely going to affect the future of Canada-India relations. There might be really downturn moments at present, but again, given the kind of foreign policy posturing and futuristic plan Canada has got towards Indo-Pacific, I think India should only be considered as a natural partner, given the fact that there is a huge credible Indian populations are there in Canada. It's just a time before we overcome this down moment and look for a brighter Canada-India relations. In fact, since 2007, when we have established the Canada-India Foundations, one of the key flagging point about this foundation has been how to really allow the people-centric engagement to become the flag bearer in Canada-India robust partnerships. And today, the same people, the same community level engagement is becoming a barrier. So I think we have a huge task to review the relationship and then look at the downside of it, what could be corrected, and then take the necessary measures to improve the relationship, which could emerge as a strong relationship or partnerships in the age of Indo-Pacific in times to come.
Thanks so much for joining us once again. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.